I'm 36 years old and I work as a forestry engineer for an environmental consulting company in Montana. In late autumn of 2024, I took part in a routine survey to document the conditions of a protected area before the harsher winter arrived. The job was simple: inspect a few monitoring points, photograph the vegetation, and spend one night at an old station that had been used decades earlier by the Forest Service. That building was no longer visited frequently because most of the monitoring had been automated, but it was still used for specific situations like mine. I had spent nights alone in remote places before, so I saw no reason to worry. The access road was a narrow dirt track that began near Seeley Lake and climbed several miles through tall pine trees. As I gained elevation, the temperature dropped quickly, and small patches of snow began appearing along the sides of the road. The truck's radio kept losing signal, and my phone lost service long before I arrived. When I finally spotted the station shortly before sunset, it looked exactly like it did in the office photos. A simple wooden cabin darkened by years of weather, with a small covered porch and a storage shed attached to the back. The wind gently swayed the trees, and the entire place had that unmistakable mountain silence that settles in when there's no one else around. I unloaded my equipment, started the small generator that had been left in the shed, and quickly checked the inside of the cabin. It was old, but well-maintained. There was a wooden table, a narrow bed, a wood-burning stove, and several empty cabinets. The floorboards creaked every time I walked, which seemed perfectly normal for a building that old. I spent the last few hours of daylight photographing the surrounding area and entering notes into my tablet before a light snowfall began. It wasn't anything intense, just fine flakes drifting down slowly until they covered the ground with a smooth, even layer of white. Once darkness settled in, I lit the wood stove and prepared a simple meal. The cabin warmed up quickly, but the wind continued whistling outside, making branches scrape across the roof at irregular intervals. Before going to bed, I decided to step outside one last time to check the generator's fuel level and make sure everything would keep running overnight. The moment my flashlight swept across the ground, I noticed something that immediately stopped me in my tracks. There was a trail of very recent human footprints emerging from the trees. The snow across the clearing was still almost completely untouched, so those prints had been made after the snowfall had started. They ran in a perfectly straight line toward the station where I was staying completely alone. I stood there staring at them for several seconds, trying to understand what I was seeing. My first thought was that a hunter had passed through looking for shelter. It wasn't impossible. Even though the area was isolated, people still ventured into those mountains during hunting season. I grabbed my brighter flashlight and began following the trail. The footprints were clearly defined, left by wide-soled boots, and the edges of each print were still crisp, with no signs of melting or being covered by fresh snow. That meant they had been made only a short time earlier. As I walked, I kept scanning the trees, expecting to find someone hiding among them, or maybe hear someone call out to me. There was absolutely nothing. The only sounds were the wind moving through the pines and the occasional creak of the station's wooden frame behind me. I continued following the footprints until they reached the side wall of the cabin, directly beneath a small window that looked into one of the interior cabinets. Then they simply ended. There were no returning footprints. There weren't any tracks going around the building, nor were there any signs that someone had slipped, jumped, or climbed onto the roof. I swept my flashlight across the entire wall, looking for a ladder, a rope, or anything that could explain what I was seeing. The snow surrounding the wall remained perfectly smooth, as if whoever had made the footprints had simply vanished at that exact spot. At the time, I tried convincing myself that I had overlooked something. I walked around the station at least 3 times, shining my flashlight over every inch of the snow. I even checked the roof, imagining someone might have climbed up using one of the nearby trees. But the branches were far too far away, and there wasn't a single mark on the blanket of snow covering the roof. I returned to the footprints and took several photos with both my phone and my work camera, thinking I'd show them to my coworkers later. As I leaned in to frame one of the close-up shots, I heard a sharp sound coming from inside the cabin. It sounded like someone knocking twice with their knuckles against solid wood. I froze immediately and looked up. The sound stopped. I stood perfectly still for several seconds, waiting to hear it again. I thought it might have been the wood expanding because of the temperature difference between the warm interior and the freezing air outside. I continued taking pictures, but less than a minute later I heard the sound again. This time it was much clearer, and it seemed to come from the exact section of the wall where the footprints ended. 3 slow, evenly spaced knocks, muffled, as if something was on the other side of the wall, but inside the wall itself rather than outside the cabin. My stomach dropped instantly. I knew there wasn't enough space inside those walls for a person to be standing there. I stared at that section of the wall for several seconds, unable to decide what to do. My first instinct was to think of an animal. Squirrels, raccoons, or even a pine marten could squeeze into tight spaces and make noise inside a structure. That explanation made far more sense than anything else. Still, there was something strange about those knocks. They didn't sound like an animal running or scratching through wood. They were dry, deliberate, evenly spaced. I slowly stepped back inside the station and closed the door behind me. The warmth from the stove contrasted sharply with the cold I had carried in from the snow, but it did nothing to ease my growing sense of unease. I walked to the corresponding section of the wall from inside the cabin. It was exactly where an old cabinet had been mounted against the wall. I pushed the table aside, pressed my ear against the wood, and listened. At first, I heard nothing except the normal creaking of the heated timber. Then came 2 more knocks, so close that I felt a faint vibration against the side of my face. I stepped backward immediately. I opened the cabinet expecting to find some hidden access panel or a loose section of wall, but there were only dusty, empty shelves. I grabbed a flashlight and carefully inspected every corner, looking for a hole or any sign of animals. Nothing. I stood there for several minutes trying to convince myself there had to be a simple explanation. Even so, I decided to push a heavy piece of furniture against that section of the wall. It didn't really make sense, but it was an instinctive reaction. At that moment, being alone on that mountain felt like a much worse idea than it had just a few hours earlier. I spent the rest of the night barely sleeping. I kept the stove burning, every light turned on, and sat at the table with my emergency radio beside me, even though I knew I would probably never reach anyone from there. Every so often, I stepped onto the porch just to check whether there had been any movement in the snow. The footprints remained exactly where they had been, partially illuminated by the cabin's exterior light. Not once did another trail appear. Not once did I hear footsteps outside. The knocking returned twice more during the night, always from the same place and always after long stretches of complete silence. The knocks were never loud, never fast, just a few slow, evenly spaced taps, then silence again. I avoided getting close to that wall because no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, something deep inside me kept insisting that I should stay away. The clock seemed to move painfully slowly. Every time I looked out the window, the forest remained perfectly still beneath the snow, with no sign of people or animals. More than once I considered starting the truck and leaving before dawn, but the road was beginning to freeze, and driving alone under those conditions could easily have been more dangerous than waiting for daylight. So I stayed where I was, listening to every creak in the cabin and waiting for the first light of morning. When the sky finally began to brighten, the first thing I did was put on my jacket and go outside to check the footprints again. The snowfall had stopped during the night, so everything looked exactly as it had the evening before. I walked straight to the side of the station. The footprints still began in the forest and continued in a perfectly straight line toward the wall. I knelt down to examine them closely, thinking that daylight might reveal some detail I had missed. It didn't. The impressions remained deep and perfectly clear. They simply ended there. I walked around the entire building once again. No new footprints. No marks on the roof. No sign that anyone had used a ladder or climbing equipment. I even searched for broken branches or anything suggesting someone might have climbed using the nearby trees, but I found nothing. I decided to document everything once more with the company camera, including photographs of every side of the station to show that the trail truly had no continuation. Before going back inside to gather my belongings, I placed my hand against the wall where the footprints ended. The wood was ice cold. I stood there for several seconds, waiting to hear another knock. This time nothing happened. The silence was so complete that all I could hear was the wind moving through the trees and clumps of snow, falling from the branches whenever they swayed. I returned to the office that afternoon and showed the photographs to 2 co-workers who had known that station for many years. Both of them said someone had probably found a way to leave without leaving tracks, or that the wind might have erased part of the trail during the night. The problem was that the wind had never been strong enough to disturb the surrounding snow. In the photographs themselves, you could still see tiny branch marks and even rabbit tracks much smaller than the human footprints, all perfectly preserved. I also told them about the knocking inside the wall. One of them suggested it had probably been animals trapped inside the structure, which also sounded like a reasonable explanation. Even so, none of those theories explained why the knocking had come from the exact spot where the footprints ended. A few months later, I had to return to the same region for another assignment, but I requested to stay at a different field station. To this day, I still have those photographs saved on my company's computer. Every time I look at them, I try to find some detail that explains what happened that night. I still haven't found one. What bothers me most isn't the knocking or the fact that I was alone. It's knowing that there is a perfectly visible trail of human footprints in the snow that simply ends at the wall of a cabin, and that I was there while everything was still fresh. Story 2. My name is Emily Carter. I was 21 years old when this happened, and I was studying nursing at the University of Oklahoma. My parents lived in a small town called Hinton, about an hour west of Oklahoma City. That weekend, they had traveled to visit my grandmother, who had recently undergone a minor surgery, and I stayed at their house because I needed to study for 2 important exams the following week. I always liked how peaceful it was there. It was a quiet residential neighborhood with houses spaced far apart, surrounded by rural land. Normally, nothing unusual ever happened there, but throughout that entire week, meteorologists had been warning about severe storms and the possibility of tornadoes overnight from Saturday into Sunday. Anyone who grows up in Oklahoma learns from an early age to take those warnings seriously. Before leaving, my father placed the weather radio on the kitchen counter, already tuned to the no AA frequency, because he never trusted cell phone alerts alone. He told me to keep it nearby throughout the night in case the weather got worse. I thought he was being a little overly cautious, but I agreed. I spent the rest of the afternoon organizing my notes, making coffee, and watching through the window as the sky grew darker and darker. Even before sunset, the wind was already making the trees in the backyard sway violently, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of heavy rain approaching. Around 9 that evening, it finally started raining for real. The rain pounded against the windows, and every so often, lightning illuminated the entire street for a few seconds at a time. The power hadn't gone out yet, but it flickered occasionally. I placed the weather radio on the living room table, turned the volume up slightly, and continued studying. Anyone who's ever listened to one of those radios knows that most of the time, they simply broadcast automated bulletins, with that electronic voice repeating information about wind speeds, hail, flooding risks, and warnings for specific counties. Every now and then, a new alert would interrupt the broadcast before it returned to the continuous updates. I had stopped paying much attention to it. The rain drowned out almost every sound outside. No cars drove by, and none of the neighbors appeared at their windows. I was completely alone in the house. Close to 11 that night, I went into the kitchen to get another cup of coffee. As I was walking back toward the living room, I noticed that the weather radio had stopped its automated broadcast for a few seconds. I assumed another storm warning was about to begin. Instead, I clearly heard a calm male voice with no static or background noise whatsoever say only, "Emily, you're still in the living room." I froze in the middle of the room. The first thing I thought was that I had misunderstood what I heard. Maybe a similar name had been mentioned during an emergency report or in some message intended for someone else. I walked over to the radio and turned up the volume. The electronic weather voice immediately resumed, announcing wind speeds and the counties under severe thunderstorm warnings. I waited for several more seconds, but nothing unusual happened. I laughed nervously and tried convincing myself that my exhausted brain had connected things that weren't really connected. I had been studying for hours. I'd barely slept the night before, and I'd already had far too much coffee. I returned to the couch, but I couldn't concentrate on my notes anymore. Now I paid attention to every single word coming from the radio. Outside, the rain intensified, and the wind made some metallic object strike repeatedly at irregular intervals, probably the lid of a trash can or a forgotten tool somewhere in the yard. About 5 minutes later, the radio interrupted its automated bulletin again. This time there was no warning tone before the interruption, just silence for 2 or 3 seconds. Then the same male voice returned. It said my first name once again before calmly stating, "The kitchen light is still on. You forgot to turn it off." Every part of my body went cold. Instinctively, I turned toward the kitchen. The light really was on. I didn't remember leaving it that way, but there wasn't anything particularly strange about that. The problem was that the information made no sense. The curtains were closed. The garage was empty because my parents had taken the car with them. And the rain was falling so heavily that I could barely see the backyard through the glass in the back door. I immediately switched off the kitchen light and walked through the entire house, checking every door and window. Everything remained locked exactly as I had left it. I repeatedly looked through the narrow gaps in the blinds, trying to spot someone outside, but all I could see was rain running down the windows while flashes of lightning illuminated the lawn for brief fractions of a second. When I returned to the living room, the weather radio had already resumed its normal forecast. I grabbed my phone and decided to keep it ready to record in case it happened again. In my mind, if it was some strange interference or even an amateur radio prank, at least I'd have a recording to show my parents the following day. I was still trying to find a logical explanation, but the feeling that I was being watched inside my own house was becoming harder and harder to ignore. I sat back down on the couch, but this time I didn't even open my books. I held my phone with the camera pointed directly at the weather radio, with the recording app already running. I wanted to capture anything unusual that happened. The storm continued raging outside, and every so often a thunderclap made the windows vibrate. The clock in the living room showed a little after 11:30. For nearly 15 minutes, the radio transmitted nothing but ordinary weather bulletins tracking the storm. Little by little, I began thinking that maybe everything really had been nothing more than a coincidence or some extremely unusual interference. It was precisely when I lowered my phone for just a few seconds that the transmission stopped again. The male voice returned immediately, speaking in the exact same calm tone as before. "Emily, there's no point looking through the front window." My heart immediately started pounding. Before I could even react, the voice continued. "You should be looking at the back door." I jumped to my feet so quickly that I nearly knocked over the coffee table. I ran into the kitchen without turning on any lights besides the one already illuminating the living room. The back door was still locked. The small curtain covering the glass remained closed. For several seconds I stood there trying to decide whether I should pull it aside. Part of me told myself this was ridiculous, that there probably wasn't anyone out there. The other part simply didn't want to look. When I finally pulled the curtain open in one motion, there wasn't anyone there. Only the soaking wet backyard illuminated by flashes of lightning and the wooden fence swaying in the wind. I took a deep breath, trying to regain control. The idea that someone was playing a prank on me seemed less believable than ever. If someone had actually been outside, they would have left some kind of trace or at least appeared briefly during one of the lightning flashes. Besides, the rain was falling so heavily that standing still in the backyard for any length of time would have been nearly impossible. I quickly returned to the living room and this time left my phone recording continuously. I wanted to capture any further transmissions. A few minutes later, the weather radio emitted the familiar warning tone that always preceded an official alert. I assumed I was finally about to hear another routine weather announcement. Instead, the same voice spoke for the fourth time. "You're recording now." My stomach sank. I automatically looked at my phone screen, which was still recording video. The voice paused briefly before adding, "It won't work." The instant the sentence ended, the radio returned to Noah's electronic weather voice as though nothing had happened. I immediately checked the recording. The video clearly showed the entire living room, while perfectly capturing the sounds of the storm and the official weather bulletins. But during the exact moments when I knew without any doubt that I had heard that voice, the audio simply skipped straight to the following automated broadcast. There was no interference. No static, no audio cut. It was as though those sentences had never existed. I spent the rest of the night almost completely awake. I moved the couch closer to the kitchen, where I could see both the back door and part of the hallway leading to the bedrooms. I didn't turn on the television or wear headphones. I wanted to hear every sound coming from inside the house. The weather radio remained on the entire night, broadcasting nothing except the normal weather bulletins. The male voice never returned. By the time dawn arrived, the storm had weakened considerably, and the heavy rain had become nothing more than a steady drizzle. As soon as there was enough daylight, I went outside to inspect the property. I walked around the entire house searching for footprints, tire tracks, broken branches, or any sign that someone might have been watching the house during the night. The lawn was completely soaked and the ground near the fence had turned into mud. If anyone had remained there for any amount of time, they certainly would have left some kind of trace. I found absolutely nothing. Later that day, my parents returned from their trip, and I told them everything exactly as it had happened. My father listened without interrupting me. At first, he thought it might have been some amateur radio transmission bleeding into the frequency, but his expression changed when I showed him the video from my phone. It clearly showed me reacting, getting up from the couch and running into the kitchen while the audio captured nothing except the routine weather bulletins, with none of the sentences I had heard. That same afternoon, my father contacted the regional office responsible for the weather transmitters serving our area. After several phone calls, we managed to speak with a technician who checked the transmission logs from that night. He explained that all of their equipment maintained complete records of every alert that had been transmitted, and also logged significant failures or interference. According to him, throughout the entire storm there had been no transmissions other than the official weather bulletins, and no anomalies whatsoever recorded on the frequency covering our region. He also asked whether there had been any other radios operating inside the house. There hadn't. For several days afterward, I tried reproducing the situation by leaving the weather radio in the exact same place at the exact same time. It never happened again. Years have passed since that night, and I still keep that weather radio in a box in my parents' garage. Whenever someone talks about weather radios or severe storms, I remember the voice saying my name and describing exactly what I was doing inside a completely locked house. The hardest part for me isn't explaining why it happened. It's accepting that I heard every single word with absolute clarity, while at the same time there isn't a single recording, technical log, or piece of evidence proving that transmission ever actually existed. Story 3. My name is Nathan Brooks. I was 24 years old when this happened. At the time, I was finishing my history degree at Indiana University and using my summer break to take care of some family matters. My grandmother had passed away a few weeks earlier, and since I was the grandson who lived the closest, my parents asked me to spend a few days at her old house in Bedford, a small town in southern Indiana. The house was going to be put up for sale, but first we needed to sort through documents, clothes, photographs, and personal belongings the family wanted to keep. I had grown up visiting that house, so I knew every room very well. It was a single-story home built in the 1960s, with a narrow hallway connecting the 3 bedrooms. The last bedroom had been used by my grandmother for years as nothing more than a storage room filled with boxes. It was also the most cluttered room and the one that would take the most work to organize. Since I wasn't in any hurry and preferred to take my time, I decided to stay in the house for 3 nights so I could finish everything. It seemed much more practical than driving nearly an hour back to my apartment every day. On the first day, I worked almost the entire afternoon sorting boxes and carrying smaller pieces of furniture into the garage. The house had that familiar smell of a place that had been closed up for a while, mixed with old wood and the cleaning products my uncles had used after the funeral. I left all the windows open to let some fresh air circulate, but the atmosphere still felt heavy and silent. The only constant sounds came from the old clock in the living room and the occasional car passing on the street. Late in the afternoon, I started organizing the last bedroom. There were boxes of photographs, Christmas decorations, old clothes, and several stacks of magazines. I spent nearly 2 hours sorting everything into categories to make things easier once my parents arrived the following day. When I finished, the room looked completely different. I had cleared the center of the room, stacked the boxes neatly against one wall, and placed several smaller pieces of furniture near the door to be moved later. I closed the bedroom door and went into the kitchen to make myself a sandwich. I couldn't have been gone for more than 15 minutes. When I came back to grab another box, I stopped in the doorway, unable to understand what I was looking at. Everything was exactly the way it had been before I started organizing. The boxes were back in the same places where they had originally been scattered. The magazines had somehow returned to their piles on the floor, and even a folding chair that I had carried into the hallway was once again sitting in the corner of the room. I stood there staring into the room for a long time, trying to remember whether I had actually finished organizing it. It felt like a ridiculous question because my arms were still sore from carrying the boxes, and the sweat on my shirt hadn't even dried yet. Even so, I walked back inside and carefully examined everything. It wasn't just my imagination. The boxes I had sorted by size were mixed together again. An old fan that I had carried out to the garage was once again sitting beside the closet. Even a stack of photo albums that I clearly remembered placing on the bed had returned to the floor exactly where I had found it when I first entered the room that afternoon. The first explanation I came up with was that I was simply exhausted and had somehow confused the different stages of the work. It seemed unlikely, but it was still far more reasonable than any other possibility. I took a deep breath, grabbed a bottle of water, and started all over again. This time I paid close attention to every single object. Before moving anything, I took several pictures with my phone, then organized everything exactly the same way I had before. When I finished, I compared the room to the photos and confirmed that it really was completely different. I closed the door and walked only as far as the bathroom at the end of the hallway. I wasn't there for more than 5 minutes. The moment I stepped back into the hallway, I felt an uneasy sensation that was difficult to explain. Everything looked exactly the same as before, silent and still. But for some reason I had the overwhelming feeling that I shouldn't open that bedroom door again. Even so, I walked over, turned the doorknob, and switched on the light. My stomach dropped instantly. For the second time that night, every object had returned to its original position. Not something similar. Exactly the same. The boxes leaned at the same angles. An old blanket lay folded over an armchair exactly as I had found it earlier that afternoon, and a lamp without a bulb once again sat on top of the same cardboard box where I had first seen it. I immediately grabbed my phone and compared the photographs. The difference between the pictures I had taken only minutes earlier and what I was seeing now was undeniable. At that moment, I stopped blaming exhaustion. I began believing that someone had entered the house while I was distracted. I searched every room, looked inside every closet, behind every curtain, inside the small basement where the furnace was located, and even inside the garage. I checked the front door, the back door, and every window. Everything remained locked exactly as I had left it. I found absolutely no sign that another person had been inside the house, but the feeling that I wasn't alone there became much harder to ignore. By then, I could no longer concentrate on the work. I picked up my phone and called my father. I told him exactly what had happened, expecting him to tell me that I was overreacting or simply forgetting where I had moved things. Instead, he asked whether I had slept well the previous night and suggested that I stop working for the day. He also asked whether any window might have been left unlocked and whether any neighbors had a key to the house. I had already checked everything and told him no. Even so, just to be certain, I walked through every room once more, checking every lock and even looking underneath the beds. Nothing seemed out of place except that bedroom. After hanging up, I decided to perform a simple test. I selected only 5 cardboard boxes, lined them up neatly against the left wall, and took a photograph straight on. Then I grabbed a roll of blue painter's tape that I had been using to label items and placed small pieces on the floor marking the exact location of each box. If someone moved them, the tape markers would no longer line up. I closed the bedroom door, sat in the living room facing directly toward the hallway, and waited for about 10 minutes. During that entire time, I heard no footsteps, no doors opening, and no sounds other than the old clock ticking away and the refrigerator turning on occasionally in the kitchen. When I finally decided to open the door again, I felt a tightness in my chest before I even turned on the light. The boxes were no longer lined up against the wall. They had returned to their previous positions, scattered throughout the room exactly as I had found them when I first started cleaning. What caught my attention most were the pieces of blue tape. They were still stuck to the floor exactly where I had placed them. In other words, the boxes had somehow returned to their original positions, without matching any of the markings I had made only minutes earlier. I took more photographs and stood there for several seconds trying to find some explanation. I seriously began considering that someone might be entering through some hidden access point I didn't know about. The house was old and had been remodeled several times over the years. Maybe there was a hidden service door, a trapdoor, or some other passage I had never discovered as a child. I spent nearly an hour examining the walls, knocking on the wood inside the built-in cabinets and searching for differences between the wall panels. I found absolutely nothing. Before nightfall, I drove into town and bought a simple security camera with a memory card. My plan was to leave it recording the bedroom throughout the entire night. If someone really was entering that room, I would finally have an answer. I returned to the house shortly after dark and installed the camera on top of a low bookshelf in the hallway, aimed directly into the bedroom. I performed several tests to make sure it was recording properly. I walked in front of the lens, entered and left the room several times, then watched the footage on my phone. Everything worked perfectly. For the final time that day, I organized the entire room. I stacked every box against the wall, lined up the smaller furniture, and left only an open space in the center. Before leaving, I recorded a short video showing the condition of the room and closed the door. The camera continued recording while I prepared something to eat. I avoided constantly looking toward the hallway because I became anxious every time I remembered what had happened earlier. Around 11 that night, I decided not to open the bedroom door again until the following morning. I thought it would be better to let the camera record without any interference. I barely slept. The house made all the usual noises of old wood settling throughout the night, but I never heard footsteps, doors slamming, or anything else that would explain someone moving around inside. Even so, I woke up several times with the unmistakable feeling that someone was walking through the hallway. Every time I got up to check, everything remained exactly as I had left it. Shortly after sunrise, I went straight to the camera before I even made coffee. The recording light confirmed it had been filming all night. I removed the memory card, sat down at the kitchen table, and started reviewing the footage. The first several minutes showed exactly what I expected. Me organizing the bedroom, leaving the room, closing the door, and walking away down the hallway. After that, no one else appeared. The hallway remained completely empty for hours. Then, at approximately 2:20 in the morning, the video froze for a moment. The screen filled with small colored blocks, exactly the way a corrupted digital file looks. The glitch lasted just over 4 minutes. When the recording returned to normal, the bedroom door was still closed exactly as before. No one appeared entering or leaving. Even so, when I opened the bedroom to check, everything had once again returned to its original arrangement, exactly as it had been when I first arrived at the house on the very first day. I took the camera back to the electronics store, thinking there might be something wrong with it, but the technician found absolutely nothing wrong with either the camera or the memory card. A few months later, the house was sold and I never returned. To this day, I still keep that video file because the glitch remains in exactly the same place every time I watch it. What bothers me most isn't the fact that the room always returned to its original arrangement. It's knowing that the only camera pointed at that room lost the exact few minutes when it happened, without recording a single person entering that house. Story 4. My name is Cole Bennett. I'm 34 years old and I work as a freelance photographer. Much of my work involves photographing landscapes for travel magazines and stock photo agencies. So I spend a lot of time driving alone through remote areas of the western United States. This happened in early October of 2023, when I traveled to a nature reserve near Lander, Wyoming, to photograph the sunset over the area's rock formations. I spent practically the entire day hiking between trails and scenic overlooks, waiting for the perfect light to finish the assignment. Since I wanted to make the most of the final minutes before dark, I ended up staying much longer than I had planned. By the time I started packing my equipment, the parking lot was almost empty. Only my SUV and a pickup truck remained, and the truck left just a few minutes before I did. The ranger at the entrance mentioned that I shouldn't linger, because some of the rural roads in the area became extremely dark at night and saw very little traffic. I thanked him for the warning, loaded my equipment into the back of my SUV, and started driving back to the small hotel where I was staying in Lander. The GPS estimated about a 50-minute drive, much of it along a quiet state highway cutting through open fields and scattered rural properties. For the first 20 minutes, everything was completely normal. The road was perfectly dry, the sky remained clear, and there was still a faint glow on the horizon, although most of the landscape had already disappeared into darkness. I drove with the music playing quietly, and occasionally slowed down to watch animals near the fences. It was common to encounter deer in that area after dark, so I avoided driving too fast. After I entered a more isolated stretch of highway, I stopped seeing any other vehicles. There were no headlights approaching from the opposite direction and no lights from nearby farms. There was only the narrow road illuminated by my headlights and vast open fields on both sides. It was along that stretch that I noticed a small yellowish light far ahead. It looked like an ordinary flashlight being carried by someone walking along the road. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it might be a rancher checking a fence or someone searching for a lost animal. I continued driving normally, expecting to catch up to the person within a few minutes. But as time passed, I began noticing something that didn't make any sense. The light remained at exactly the same distance. It swayed slowly from side to side, just like someone walking, yet I never seemed to get any closer to it. The first thing I did was glance at my speedometer. I was traveling just over 50 miles per hour. I slowed down to 40, thinking I might be misjudging the distance because of the darkness. The light remained exactly where it was. A few minutes later, I accelerated to nearly 65 simply to test it. The result was the same. It continued swaying gently, always maintaining exactly the same position relative to my vehicle. That started bothering me because on a perfectly straight road like that, I should have noticed any change in distance. It seemed impossible for someone walking to perfectly match the speed of a vehicle that kept changing pace. I still tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe the light was much farther away than I realized, and my brain was being fooled by the lack of visual reference points. At night in wide open areas, it's easy to lose your sense of depth. I kept driving while watching it carefully. The movement of the flashlight remained constant. It rose and fell slightly as though it were swinging naturally from the hand of someone walking at an ordinary pace. Occasionally it disappeared for a second before immediately reappearing in exactly the same spot on the road. After nearly 15 minutes of following that light without seeing any change whatsoever, I turned off the music so I could pay closer attention to my surroundings. I lowered the driver's window slightly. The air was cold, and the only sound was the steady hum of my tires rolling across the pavement. Not a single other vehicle appeared during that entire time. I grabbed my phone, thinking about recording what I was seeing, but quickly gave up because the camera would probably never capture such a tiny light at that distance. I continued driving until the highway began curving gently to the right. I figured I was finally about to find out what was happening. If someone was actually walking there, I should catch up once I came out of the curve. I kept my eyes fixed on the light the entire time. As soon as my SUV exited the curve and entered another straight stretch of road, I accelerated slightly. The flashlight remained visible for a few more seconds. Then it vanished. Not like someone had switched it off. It simply ceased to exist. Instinctively, I lifted my foot off the accelerator and continued driving to the exact point where it should have been. When I arrived, I found nothing except an old wooden fence running alongside the highway and an empty field stretching endlessly on both sides. There were no people, no vehicles, no buildings, nowhere someone could possibly have disappeared within the few seconds that the light had vanished. I pulled over onto the shoulder and remained there for a few moments with the engine still running, my headlights illuminating the fence. I grabbed the flashlight I always carried in my backpack and stepped outside to inspect the area more carefully. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and the wind swept across the open fields without encountering a single obstacle. I walked several yards along the fence searching for a gate, footprints, tire tracks, or any indication that someone had recently passed through. The ground was covered with short, dry grass. There was no mud or sand where tracks could be identified. I shined my flashlight as far into the field as I could, but the beam simply disappeared into the darkness. I also saw no houses, silos, or barns nearby. I returned to the road and looked back in the direction I had come from. The highway was completely empty. For a few seconds, I started convincing myself that everything had simply been an illusion, created by distance and the lack of visual references. I had driven through isolated places at night many times before and knew that perception could sometimes be deceptive. I took a deep breath, got back into the SUV, and continued driving. My plan was simply to reach town and forget about the whole thing. I couldn't have driven even a full minute before I glanced automatically into the rearview mirror. It was one of those quick looks you make without even thinking. The instant I looked, a chill ran through my entire body. The same yellowish light was behind my vehicle. Not particularly close, but at exactly the same distance where it had remained in front of me during the entire earlier drive. It swayed slowly from side to side with the exact same steady movement I had watched for miles. My first reaction was to look for another vehicle's headlights, but it definitely wasn't a car or a motorcycle. There was only a single isolated point of light in the darkness. I decided to repeat the same test as before. I slowed down dramatically. The light remained exactly where it was. I accelerated again. It continued following my SUV without getting any closer or farther away. I repeatedly looked through my side mirrors trying to see it directly, but I could only ever spot it in the rearview mirror. Acting on impulse, I slammed on the brakes much harder than I should have, expecting that whoever or whatever was behind me would either have to stop as well or quickly close the distance. My SUV almost came to a complete stop in the middle of the highway. When I looked back into the rearview mirror, the light was still there, motionless at exactly the same distance, slowly swaying back and forth as though my sudden braking had never affected it at all. At that point, I decided I wasn't going to run any more experiments. I accelerated again and continued driving toward town without constantly looking behind me. Even so, it was impossible to ignore the reflection of that light in my rearview mirror. Every few seconds, my eyes drifted back to it. I drove for more than 20 additional minutes, and it remained in exactly the same position the entire time. When I finally saw the first lights of a small rural community ahead, I felt a tremendous sense of relief. There was a gas station still open at the entrance to town. I quickly pulled into the parking lot, thinking that if it really was a person walking, or some distant vehicle, I would finally find out. I parked directly in front of the convenience store and got out immediately. Before I even closed the driver's door, I looked back toward the highway I had just traveled. There was absolutely nobody there. No headlights, no flashlight, no vehicle following me. I remained outside for several minutes talking with the gas station clerk while pretending to browse the drink cooler. Then I casually asked whether it was common to see people walking along that highway at night. He told me he almost never saw pedestrians there, especially after dark, because that stretch of road crossed enormous ranches and was completely deserted. A few minutes later, I got back into my SUV and finished the drive to the hotel without encountering anything else unusual. The following day, before leaving Wyoming, I decided to drive through that exact same stretch of highway again during daylight. I wanted to see whether there was some building, lighting tower, or object that could have created an illusion of perspective the previous night. I drove slowly along the entire road and found nothing except old fences, open pastures, and a few ranch gates scattered throughout the properties. At the exact location where I had stopped the night before, there were no utility poles, floodlights, reflective signs, or anything else capable of producing that light. There weren't even any trails leading into the fields. Since then, I've photographed many other remote locations throughout the United States and still spend a great deal of time driving alone. I've never seen anything remotely similar again. I still try convincing myself that there must have been a simple explanation involving darkness, distance, or exhaustion after an entire day of work. But there's one detail that continues to bother me. I can accept that I may have misinterpreted a light in front of me. What I've never been able to explain is why, after I reached the exact spot where it should have been and found nothing but an empty field, that same light appeared behind my vehicle and followed me for nearly the entire rest of the drive, maintaining mile after mile the exact same distance. Story 5. My name is Lauren Mitchell. I'm 38 years old and I live in Kansas City, Missouri. This happened at the beginning of 2024, just a few months after my parents decided to sell the house where I grew up in a small town called Nevada, Missouri. They had both retired and decided to move into a smaller condominium closer to my sister. Since I was the only one in the family with a good scanner and the habit of organizing our digital archives, I was put in charge of sorting through the old photo albums before everything else was packed away. My mother was determined to preserve the photographs because they included countless pictures from birthdays, barbecues, Christmas celebrations, and family gatherings dating back to the 1990s. I decided to spend an entire weekend at the house so I could take my time. The realtor also asked me to photograph the empty property once I finished, so he could update the listing before prospective buyers started visiting. I thought it would be a simple job. The house was already almost completely empty, with only a few old pieces of furniture and several boxes of belongings that still needed sorting. I had always loved that place, so I thought spending 2 days there surrounded by old memories might even be a little nostalgic. On Saturday morning, I set up a table in the dining room, turned on my laptop, and began scanning the photo albums in chronological order. It was slow work, but peaceful. While the scanner was running, I often found myself looking through the photographs before placing them on the glass. Many had been taken in the backyard, where my father used to host barbecues and set up a small swimming pool every summer. Others showed birthday parties, games with my cousins, and family gatherings near a line of trees at the edge of the property. After several hours, I noticed something that I initially dismissed as a coincidence. In a photograph from my 8th birthday, there was a man standing far in the background near the trees. He was too far away to appear clearly, but I could tell he was wearing a dark jacket and seemed to be looking toward the camera. I assumed he was a neighbor walking along the road behind the property, or perhaps a distant relative I simply didn't remember. I continued scanning without giving it much thought. About 20 minutes later, I came across another photograph. This one taken roughly 5 years later during one of my father's birthday barbecues. The same man, or someone who looked remarkably similar, was standing in the background again, almost in exactly the same location, facing the house. That was when I truly started paying attention. Instead of continuing to scan the albums, I started flipping back through them to check the other photographs. The more I searched, the more often that man appeared. He wasn't in every picture, but he showed up frequently enough that it no longer felt like a coincidence. There was a photograph taken at Christmas while my cousins were playing in the snow, another from an Easter lunch, one where my father was proudly showing off a brand new lawnmower, and even one taken the day my dog came home when I was a teenager. In every one of them, he stood far away near the line of trees marking the edge of the property. He was never close to my family. He never waved at the camera. He simply stood there facing us. Some of the photographs had been taken more than 10 years apart, yet his clothing looked strikingly similar. And from what little I could make out, he didn't seem to have aged very much either. That made me uncomfortable, although I still tried finding a logical explanation. Maybe he was a neighbor who regularly walked through the area, an employee from a nearby farm, or someone using the trail behind the property. I picked up my phone and started photographing every image where he appeared, so I could compare them side by side. His position changed slightly depending on the camera angle, but he was always standing in the same section of the yard. I decided to call my mother, assuming she would immediately recognize him. I sent her 3 photographs through our messaging app and simply asked who the man in the background was. She replied almost immediately that she had no idea what I was talking about. I enlarged one of the photographs and circled the figure using my phone's editing tools. A few minutes later, she called me. She said she had never noticed that detail before, and asked whether I had edited the pictures as a joke. I told her I hadn't. My father joined the call as well, and spent several silent moments studying the images I had sent. Then he commented that if someone had really been standing in that spot for so many years, he certainly would have noticed because he spent nearly every weekend taking care of the backyard. I asked whether anyone owned property behind the trees. He said no. Beyond that line was nothing but an empty field belonging to another farm separated by an old fence. The conversation ended without any answers. I continued staring at the photographs for several more minutes, and for the first time since arriving at the house, I felt the urge to close the living room curtains, even though it was still early afternoon. As I did, I couldn't help glancing toward the same line of trees that appeared in nearly every one of those old photographs. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to finish my work, but I could no longer look at the albums the same way. Whenever I found a picture taken in the backyard, my eyes immediately went to the background before I even looked at my own family. In some photographs, the man wasn't there. In others, he was standing once again among the trees or beside the fence, always far enough away that recognizing his face was impossible. What disturbed me most was his posture. He never appeared to be walking, talking to someone, or doing anything remotely ordinary. He simply stood there facing the house. I picked one of the oldest photographs and walked out into the backyard to compare the framing. I easily recognized the exact place where my father usually stood when taking pictures. The large tree was still there, along with part of the old wooden fence in the distance. I stood there for several minutes looking toward the same area, trying to imagine who could remain standing in that spot for years without anyone in my family ever noticing. The distance was considerable, but not enough to completely hide a person. Besides, if someone had really been standing there during a barbecue or birthday party, surely one of the adults would have noticed. The harder I tried to fit everything into a logical explanation, the less sense it made. On Sunday morning, I finished packing the remaining photo albums and started photographing the house for the realtor. I walked through every room, taking pictures of the empty interior before finally going out into the backyard. I photographed the rear of the house, the lawn, and the trees, because the realtor wanted to emphasize the size of the property and the listing. It was a bright sunny day, so I didn't bother checking every photograph on the spot. I simply finished the job, locked the house, and returned to my apartment. Later that evening, while selecting the best photographs on my computer, I enlarged one of the backyard images to adjust the lighting. That's when my stomach dropped. Standing among the trees in exactly the same area where the man appeared throughout the old photo albums, there was another dark figure. It stood far away, partially hidden behind a tree trunk, in the exact same position where I had seen it repeatedly in photographs from my childhood. The more I zoomed in, the worse the image quality became because of the resolution, but I could still clearly distinguish the outline of a person standing there facing the house. I had spent several minutes in that backyard that morning. I didn't remember seeing anyone at all. I immediately called the realtor and asked whether he had visited the property that Sunday. He said no, and explained that he wasn't planning to stop by until the middle of the following week. Next, I called the neighbor who had lived beside our house ever since I was a child. I thought perhaps he would recognize the man from the old photographs or know someone who regularly crossed the field behind the property. I sent him one of the scanned photographs followed by the picture I had taken that morning. A few minutes later, he replied that he had never seen the man before. He also mentioned that since my parents had moved away, almost nobody passed through that area because the rear fence separated the property from an empty field that had remained closed off for many years. I asked whether someone could have entered through there without being noticed. He said it was possible but unlikely, because anyone would have had to walk a considerable distance across open ground before reaching the trees. I spent the rest of that night carefully comparing every photograph. I couldn't prove it was exactly the same person, but the position, approximate height, and the way the figure simply stood there facing the house were disturbingly similar in images taken more than a decade apart. A few days later, I gave my parents all the digitized photo albums and showed the photographs once again to several of my uncles and aunts during a family lunch. No one recognized the man. Some believed it was nothing more than a coincidence caused by the poor quality of the old photographs. Others suggested it was probably a hunter, a distant neighbor, or someone simply passing through the property at the exact moments the pictures had been taken. I wish I could believe that, but there's one detail I've never been able to forget. The figure appears in photographs taken during different seasons over nearly 15 years, always in the same section of the backyard, and always facing the house. And when I photographed that very same spot after the property had been emptied for sale, I once again found what looked like the same person standing among the trees without ever noticing them while I was actually there. The house was sold a few months later, and I never returned to the property. I still keep every digitized photograph on an external hard drive. Every now and then I open the folder hoping to find some explanation I somehow overlooked before. To this day, I still can't decide what bothers me more: the fact that no one in my family recognizes that man, or the realization that for so many years, someone seemed to be watching our house without ever drawing anyone's attention. Story 6. My name is Travis Reynolds. I'm 41 years old and I've worked as a building maintenance technician for more than 15 years. My company provides maintenance services for public schools throughout Nebraska, mainly during holidays and school breaks, when the buildings are empty and inspections can be carried out without disrupting classes. This happened over Memorial Day weekend in 2024. That week, I was assigned to inspect an old elementary school on the outskirts of Kearney that had been closed for just over a year. The school district planned to renovate the building into an administrative center, but first they needed a complete report on the electrical system, fire doors, and ventilation. Since the job was straightforward and expected to take only a single day, no one saw any reason to send a second technician. I arrived shortly after 8 o'clock that morning. A district employee unlocked the main gate, handed me a temporary access card, and explained that I would be the only person inside the building throughout the day. Before leaving, he added that the electronic access system recorded every entry and exit through the main doors, so I just needed to call if any problems came up. I assumed it would be just another routine inspection like the countless others I'd already done. The school was larger than I had expected. It had 2 floors, long hallways, empty classrooms, and a separate gymnasium behind the main building. Even though it had been closed, it was clean and relatively well maintained. The emergency lights worked normally, and the main electrical system remained active in part of the building specifically to allow inspections like mine. I spent the morning checking the first floor without finding anything unusual. I tested electrical panels, emergency exits, smoke detectors, and several air conditioning units. Around noon, I headed upstairs carrying only my tool backpack, a tablet for completing the inspection report, and a handheld radio that I rarely ever needed to use. That hallway was much quieter than the rest of the school. Since every classroom was empty, every footstep echoed across the tile floor. As I was writing down the room numbers, I noticed movement at the far end of the hallway. One of the heavy metal fire doors was slowly swinging shut until it gently touched the frame. I didn't think much of it at first. I assumed someone had simply left it partially open before I arrived. I walked over, opened it completely, and continued working. A few minutes later, after leaving another classroom and glancing back into the hallway, I saw the exact same door slowly closing once again in exactly the same way. I stopped what I was doing and walked straight over to the door. Before anything else, I looked around for an open window. There weren't any. Every classroom along that hallway had thick glass windows facing the inner courtyard, and every one of them was locked. The ventilation system wasn't running either. I pushed the door open several times to check whether the hydraulic closer needed adjustment. It worked perfectly. Whenever I opened it all the way, it stayed in place for several seconds before closing slowly and steadily, exactly the way any fire door of that type should. The strange part was that on both previous occasions I was certain I had left it completely open. I decided to perform another test. I opened the door all the way, confirmed that it remained perfectly still, and walked about 20 yards down the hallway toward the next classroom. I hadn't even stepped inside when I heard the unmistakable sound of the metal latch touching the frame. I turned immediately. The door was once again finishing its slow movement into the closed position. I stood there watching it for several seconds, trying to come up with a simple explanation. Maybe the floor had an almost imperceptible slope, or perhaps the hydraulic closer had some intermittent defect. Even so, that didn't explain why the door stayed open whenever I stood beside it and only started closing after I walked away. I spent nearly 15 minutes doing nothing but testing that door before continuing my inspection. I opened it, closed it, timed the hydraulic closer, and even used a small pocket level to check whether the floor had any noticeable slope. Nothing appeared unusual. Whenever I stayed nearby, the door behaved exactly as it should. The problem only returned once I walked away. On the fourth attempt, I decided to observe it from a distance. I stepped into a classroom with the door partially open and discreetly watched the hallway. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then, without any noticeable wind or vibration, the door slowly began moving by itself once again. It wasn't a sudden movement. It was slow, steady, and exactly like someone gently pushing the heavy metal door until it rested against the frame. I quickly walked toward it, thinking I would finally witness some kind of mechanical malfunction. By the time I reached it, the door was already completely closed. I ran my hand around the frame, examined the upper hinge, and checked the hydraulic closer again. Everything remained solid. At that point, I felt more irritated than frightened. I needed to finish the inspection report, and that door was wasting an enormous amount of my time. That's when I decided to stop it from moving by using one of the fire extinguishers mounted on the hallway wall. I removed the extinguisher from its bracket and placed it firmly between the door and the wall, so the door would remain fully open. I made sure to wedge it tightly against the metal door so there wasn't enough space for any movement. I even pushed against the door several times to confirm that it absolutely couldn't close. If there really was a problem with the hydraulic closer, this would solve it immediately. I even took a picture with my phone showing exactly how the extinguisher was positioned, because I intended to attach it to my report if it became necessary to recommend replacing the door. After that, I walked to inspect 2 classrooms at the opposite end of the hallway. I couldn't have been gone more than 8 or 9 minutes. While checking several electrical outlets inside an old computer lab, I heard an incredibly loud noise echo throughout the second floor. It sounded like metal striking the floor, immediately followed by a heavy door slamming shut. The sound was so loud it echoed through the entire hallway. My first thought was that the fire extinguisher had somehow fallen over by itself. I grabbed my tools and hurried back. The moment I turned into the hallway, I immediately saw that something was wrong. The door was completely closed again. The fire extinguisher was no longer wedged between the door and the wall. Instead, I found it lying several yards farther down the hallway, almost in front of another classroom. It hadn't simply fallen beside the door the way it would have if it had slipped. It had come to rest much farther away, as though it had been thrown down the hallway. I walked toward it, trying to mentally reconstruct what could possibly have happened. I carefully examined the floor, looking for impact marks or uneven surfaces that might explain how it had traveled so far. There were none. I took out my phone again and compared the scene to the photograph I had taken only minutes earlier. The original position was exactly as I remembered it. I returned the fire extinguisher to its wall bracket and stood silently for several seconds staring at the closed door. For the first time since arriving at the building, I felt a sense of unease that I couldn't explain away as a maintenance issue. Even so, before jumping to any conclusions, I decided to call the school district employee and ask whether anyone else could have entered the building while I was working. He answered almost immediately. I explained what had happened and asked whether a custodian, security guard, or another technician had entered the school without informing me. He said no. While we were talking, he accessed the electronic system that logged every use of the access cards at the main entrances. He remained silent for several moments while looking at his screen before telling me that, since the moment I had entered that morning, there had been no other recorded entries or exits. To eliminate any remaining doubt, he asked me to stay on the line while he also checked the security cameras covering the outside entrances. A short while later, he returned with exactly the same answer. No one had entered the building. Even so, he suggested that I thoroughly inspect every room again before leaving, just to make sure there wasn't an intruder hiding somewhere inside. I spent nearly 40 minutes opening every classroom on the second floor, checking bathrooms, storage rooms, janitorial closets, and even the small cabinets where school supplies had once been kept. Then I went downstairs and repeated the process throughout the first floor and the gymnasium. The entire school remained completely empty. When I returned upstairs to retrieve my backpack, the fire door was still closed exactly as I had left it after the impact. This time I didn't even try opening it again. I simply finished my final notes and left. The following week I submitted my inspection report as usual. I only wrote that the fire door required a more thorough inspection because it had demonstrated inconsistent behavior during testing. I didn't mention the fire extinguisher or anything else that had happened because I knew no one would believe that part of the story. A few days later, I ran into an older technician from my company who had worked at that school before it closed. Without going into detail, I asked whether he remembered any specific problems with that particular fire door. He said no. The only thing he mentioned was that people often complained about that hallway because every sound echoed much more loudly there than anywhere else in the building. I never returned to that school. Even now, I still try to find a purely mechanical explanation for what happened. Maybe there was some extremely specific defect that I simply failed to identify that day. But after so many years working in building maintenance, I've never seen a heavy fire door move a steel fire extinguisher several yards across a hallway and then close completely without leaving any indication of what actually happened. What bothers me most is knowing that, according to both the access control system and the entrance security cameras, throughout that entire holiday weekend, I was officially the only person inside that building.
Thank you very much for your company until the end. Your support is what gives life to this channel. If these stories have caught you, don't forget to leave your like and comment on your opinion. And if you are not yet part of our community, sign up now to receive the next real horror stories.